This review is for a non-fiction book that I have just finished reading, though far, far from the first time. Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales by Marie Louise Von Franz. This book has had an incredible impact on how I read fantasy, how I read science fiction, how I read any fiction really, but especially fairy tales, which I have been discussing a little bit recently. I felt that I had to reread this at the moment to sort of refresh my ideas and give a more conscious consensus about how I feel about the fairy tales that I've been reading and reviewing. So a little bit about this book. Marie Louise Von Franz was a Jungian psychologist. She was a practicing analyst. She was an academic. She's written many books. This is only one of hers that I've read, though it's definitely my favourite. She was a student of Carl Jung, and this book is from two lecture series that she gave, The Problem of the Shadow in Fairy Tales in 1957 and Dealing with Evil in Fairy Tales in 1964. She gave those lectures. I feel they're probably part of an academic course in the Jung Institute in Zurich. You don't have to have psychology background to enjoy this book. I think it classes kind of as a popular science in that everything you really need to enjoy and understand it is there. Maybe a few concepts aren't. It wouldn't hurt if you knew who Sigmund Freud was, what his relationship to Carl Jung was, what the concepts of consciousness and superconsciousness and ego in Jungian psychology are, and what the superego of Freudian psychology, but it doesn't really matter. And in these days, you've got Google and Wikipedia. Anyway, they'll answer any of the questions you might happen to have. However, the way I came to this book did come from reading science fiction. Rereading psychology. I was still reading science fiction, I promise you. So sometime in my early 20s, me and an ex-boyfriend were right into the reading psychology. We weren't studying it or doing a course or anything like that, but we were just interested. So we read all the Erich Fromm books. We read a lot of comparisons of Jungian and Freudian psychology. We read all that stuff. Now, after that, when we split up, I returned to Melbourne, and yet another friend caught me reading a fairy tale. I never grew out of fairy tales and I never grew out of children's books, but in your 20s, you can sometimes a little bit sensitive about what you read. I was sensitive about letting too many people know I read them, but he caught me reading one and he sort of hesitated and he recommended this book. So Arik, if you're listening to this, best book recommendation ever. I think this is the actual book that you bought me at the time, but I've been rereading it ever since. It never disappoints. So that's where I came from with this. I was very ready for it, both from the psychology. The Jungian symbology always interested me far more than Freud. And this book, like I said, is my favourite because it's so very relevant to my ongoing reading experiences. Alright, so part one comes from that first lecture series, The Problem of the Shadow in Fairy Tales. And in chapters 1 to 5, I made so many notes. This is all the times I've read this book. This is the first time I've actively read it. I've never gone into for note-taking before. So many notes this time. I read it with the intention of reviewing it, as well as refreshing my memory for what it said, and notes, lots of them. So chapters 1 to 5 from the first lecture series concentrate on the concept of shadow. They define how this book uses shadow and what it's for in fairy tales. And it phrases it within the Jungian structure of mythology. And here it is seen as a personification of aspects of the unconscious mythology. So these are the aspects of a person's unconscious, which could be added to the ego complex, but for some reason they're not. Now, a lot of important points are made in those first 5 chapters. It makes the point that this shadow can contain both intensely personal and also social collective elements. And you see that in any sort of symbology. You will have a symbol and it means something to society, but to you personally it means something different and it varies from society to another. Let's take car. I can see mine out the window. A car in many aspects of Australian life, especially outback or inland Australian life, is a symbol of maturity. You're finally old enough to drive, and then you have your first car. It's a freedom. In some aspects of European society, I've come to see it's seen as superfluous and even looked down on slightly, because a lot of Europe has other options for transport. But if you're living out in the boondocks of Australia, it's walk or drive. And walking in 40-degree heat Celsius, not always a good idea. And often not possible because the distances are immense. So here already we have two completely different social perspectives on a car. Many people are a little bit scared of them, take a long time to learn to drive. Others are driving the second the law allows them, and often even before. So you've got a lot of emotional loading, both personal and social, on cars. There are some societies in which the idea of personal car ownership is an impossible goal, because only the very wealthy in that society will ever own their own car. Again, huge variety. Now, the social collective can affect the personal ethic, and I'm not on cars anymore, and I'm about fairy tales and the unconscious and the subconscious. If you see an individual in a crowd, they will often act differently. Their own personal integrity and ethical basis may not change, but they will be affected by the crowd. And Marie Louise Von Franz, being from Switzerland, often uses the examples of how you saw people behaving in World War II. An individual might be a perfectly good, honest person, but put them at a Nazi party meeting and their ethics were subsumed by the collective. If they were a heavily conscious individual, they might have been aware of that being subsumed, but other ones might go home and awake as if from a dream, not being able to believe what they'd said, what they'd done, what they had bought into from the collective outlook. A few other separate points she makes, and I particularly love this next one. Until the 17th century, fairy tales were not reserved for children. They were told by adults to adults, by adults to children, by children to children, but these were the stories that made up the group psychology. These were the stories that society used to perpetrate who they were, in a way that we don't really use fairy tales in that way. But until the 17th century, they weren't put into the childish category at all, and I love that. I don't want to live in the 17th century, but I love that fact. Fairy tales mean something, and through hearing about them, you can be linked again with the living traditions, which is why in early societies they were so important, especially in the non-literate societies where you didn't have reading and you didn't have other ways of telling the stories and reinforcing social values. Fairy tales did all of that. And the book talks in the early chapters, but a little bit throughout, of the numinous quality. So numinous is a word I've stopped using over the years because no one really knows what I mean, but numinous can be seen to be that moment of awe and amazement that for many people is achieved through gods or religions, but for many of us it can be attributed to other things. Walking on the beach, watching the waves roll in, going to the forest, walking in the quiet forest, seeing an amazing geological feature. All of these things will give different people a sense of awe, being taken out of themselves, of the world being so much bigger than you ever thought it was. That is your numinous quality. And Von Franz talks a lot about how that applies in societies and how it relates to fairy tales and religions. Anyway, moving on, archetypal material and origins of fairy tales, and also their ability to migrate between cultures. So Marie Louise Von Franz apparently had a whole series in German, so I don't know what the titles mean, of fairy tales, each volume from a different country. And one of the things I adore about this book is you have fairy tales from everywhere. Archetypal material has the ability to migrate between cultures in fairy tale form, but less so in myths. So early in the early lecture series, she talks about the difference between myths, regular stories, and fairy tales. and how the myths tend to be very culture based, and the archetypes in a story tend to be very polarized, but fairy tales need to appeal to a deep emotional, social, I'm not sure, feeling in humanity, and they can migrate. So her example is one man from a very small isolated village in the mountains moves to another village with a fairy tale that's local to his village. In the new village, they don't know that fairy tale, so he tells it. It's obviously before the 17th century. And it will become part of that second village's mythology as well, but they may change things. From being a miller, it may be a farmer, an actual name may change, small things that will make it relevant to that culture. And she describes that migration in fairy tales in a way that you can't really get from mythology. And having read Greek mythology, I've got to say, unless you know a lot about the Greek culture, a lot of the mythology is going to be a little bit wobbly. And in modern books like Circe, where they've taken Greek mythology to make it a modern fairy story, some bits work better than others. So here she mentions archetypes in fairy tales and the polarization. She mentions the story of the two travellers, where there is a tailor and a shoemaker both travelling to a court. And in that story, you've got the tailor being read as the good person and the shoemaker being read as the bad person. But it can be argued, at least in Jungian symbology, that both are actually shadows of each other. The story doesn't exist without both of them. You can't have just the good tailor because there's no story, there's no push. You can't have just the bad shoemaker because he's just a bad person. Bad things happen to him eventually. But the two having no independent relevance to a story means that in Von Franz's interpretation of this fairy tale, that they are actually aspects of each other, and that she argues that this is archetypal to humanity and is seen in many older religions as well. There's sort of two aspects. She mentions it seems to be an archetypal law of general validity, that every symbolism which has taken shape and form in collective human consciousness wears out after a certain amount of time and resists renewal owing to a certain inertia on the consciousness. And when I read, that's page 27, if anyone wants to check up on my reference, that really explained to me why some stories are completely ubiquitous in parts of history and then virtually go extinct. They'll morph for a while, like Rose Red, which comes into part 2, Snow White and Rose Red. A fairy story that was very ubiquitous in early Christianity. I think the Grimm's brothers mentioned it. I'm not sure about that. But these days, it seems to be virtually extinct. And the reasons for that come into a later part. There have been a couple of people who rewrite fairy tales for modern audiences as stories, have done Snow White and Rose Red. It never works quite as well as Beauty and the Beast. So I think maybe that social inertia has applied to that fairy tale. I feel at this point, the controversy over Disney recently has led me back into more attention to fairy tales. I feel that someone in Disney should consider fairy tales who slowly drop out of human consciousness, and maybe get one of their staff to read this book and apply it to some of their recent decision making. I think it would advantage Disney no end if they did that. And if anyone from Disney is watching and wants to take that on board, I will just say I will give you very reasonable rates if you choose me. Okay, Von Franz also relates the dropping of fairy tales out of conscious mythology to declining interest in Christianity. And she says that that happens with other stories as well. A story that is numinous and relevant and impactful, all of a sudden it sort of falls into too much common use and people just aren't getting what they need from it anymore. Another thing that she relates to some of the early fairy tales is the question of cruelty and evil doing. Again, Disney, I'm looking at you just a little bit. A lot of modern discussions and a lot of modern thinkers want fairy tales to be sanitized. They want to take out the cruel destruction of evildoers and redeem them instead. They seem to feel that these cruel aspects, these harsh truths, aren't good for children. Von Franz points out that these evildoers are not really people. They are more adequately described as archetypes, and which their own destructiveness means that they need to be rooted out. And if the individual whose psyche they are part of is to survive, the evildoer needs to be completely subsumed. And she compares that, I assume it's from her analysis, and I don't know if it's still a contemporary opinion, that if you've got someone with a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, you can't compromise with that, but you need to root out the addiction. Anyway, I don't know if that's true or not anymore. If you're a psychologist, tell me how it relates if you want to. In chapter 3, she makes a point I also adore, which is fairy tales mean something, and through hearing about them, you can be linked again with living traditions. Have I said that already? Sorry if I have. And she also talks about the forbidden chamber in fairy tales, which is a frequent theme. Now, Von Franz concentrates more on the ones with positive figures, but I think there are at least as many of the Bluebeard's chambers as there are Princess and the Golden Roof ones. So in Princess and the Golden Roof, the forbidden chamber is where the hero is resurrected and good things happen. I'm more aware of the bad chambers, the scary ones. But even in those lovely and elevated chambers she talks about, the things that are found there, like in the case of the Princess of the Golden Roof, a beautiful painting which captivates the new king into going on a quest. Even in these elevated chambers, they're normally part of a hazardous quest or precipitation of change in the hero. So the chamber in Jungian analysis represents a living psychological feature which the consciousness wishes to keep repressed. And in The Princess of the Golden Roof is the start of an ongoing theme throughout the book of how many fairy tales in European Christianity have cut the female in half, the psyche in half, with the female and the male being separated, and the female, who she says is represented in Catholicism by the Virgin Mary, is separated out from the male and sometimes needs to be redeemed by the psyche, or in the fairy tale, in order for the person to be complete or for the fairy tale to reach its conclusion. She also makes the point that the Protestant faith doesn't even have that female element. Later, in pages 126 to 127, she talks about the Black Madonnas and how the archetype of the witch Earth Mother had entered into the Christian consciousness through the Black Madonna. I don't know about that either. I didn't remember about them at all. It's interesting reading. Okay, in chapter 5, she talks in The Stone or the Statue. And in that myth, it discusses how neither the dream nor the fairy tale is ever truly conscious. Rather, they are products of the unconscious, perpetually on the fringe of both the conscious and the unconscious, sort of swinging along that line. And because of this, Von Franz doesn't rate stories written by individuals as being true fairy stories. She believes that a writer cannot truly, consciously disconnect their own personal darkness or their own subconscious from the story that they're writing. And they can't walk out of the darkness of the society they come from in order to make something that is truly mythological. And here she mentions Hans Christian Andersen specifically as being very gifted at portraying his country, but also describes him as neurotic, and because of this, his stories have a predominantly tragic atmosphere, because for him, connection with the anima is never made. Now, I found this story interesting because Andersen's stories, some of them were recorded fairy tales in as much as the Brothers Grimm was recorded fairy stories, and Von Franz doesn't really seem to have a problem with the Brothers Grimm, so I'm not sure why she does with Andersen. I would further point out that some of Andersen's, most specifically the one he wrote, have now entered into common consciousness, and I believe they are part of our fairy tale mythology very much. The Little Mermaid, it may come from his own darkness, it may have come from the darkness of his society, but that is a fairy story for these generations. Mine, at any rate. And having recently read The Hobbit, I'll extend that to Tolkien here. Where are you? There you are. So many of the themes and points that von Franz makes in this book about mythology and fairy tales and the unconscious, I think apply to The Hobbit in many ways. The group conscious versus the individual consciousness. So many of the quest elements, I kept wowing myself by seeing connections to that book which I've just finished and this book which I was reading now. Anyway, this is turning into the most epic, long review, and I've only just reached part 2 based on the second lecture series, and that's evil. This part starts from the assumed point that fairy tales mirror collective unconscious material, begging the question that, if so, are there ethical problems in fairy tales? And why is that the question? Because it implies a lack of independent good and evil, rather evil and good being constructs of society. And of course, each society does have ethical tendencies, and individuals have self-evaluation as to their own actions, though those ethics and evaluations will differ from one society to another. Jungian psychology, or Jung, says specifically that analytically there's a separation in individual between unconscious motivations and conscious motivations. And as a zoologist, I would really like one day to see that applied to animals, because animal consciousness wasn't even a topic of discussion really for most people in the 50s, though von Franz has read Konrad Lorenz's King Solomon's Ring and knows about his work with consciousness in animals, so that's an interesting link. Anyway, that's an aside. In the second part, chapters 6 to 12, we get into types of evil such as possessions, taboos, hot and cold evil, which von Franz talks about separately. And there is a lot of discussion about the character of the successful hero and his actions, which can be very contradictory from one story to another. And that's something that she points out about fairy tales all throughout. Sometimes the right thing is to tell the truth, sometimes the right thing is to tell the lie, sometimes the right thing is to run away, sometimes the right thing is to stay. There is no consistency in fairy tale, even within a region, let alone between regions. So each fairy tale, if you break it down, you can see why the hero is telling the truth or why the hero is lying to the evil giant. But each one has its own very deep narrative, rather than just a consistent, straightforward answer to everything, which I think is where trying to make fairy tales politically correct is never going to work for you, because you're reacting to the superficial part of the story rather than the emotive or the numinous part of the story. Okay, second part, we really get into fairy tales from all around the world, which I love. One of my favorites is Vasilia the Beautiful, a story from Russia. The cover art on this book is actually from that story, where Vasilia ends up in Baba Yaga's cottage. I've always loved the Baba Yaga. Always been a fascinating story. The cover art is by Ivan I. Bilibin from Vasilia the Beautiful in Russian Folk Tales. Copyright 1995. Shambhala Publications. In case you're interested. Great artwork. By this point we start getting fairy tales from China, Japan, quite a few from First Nation South American tribes, also some North American. Anyway, love the fairy tales, and there's heaps of them in the second part. So in chapter 6 we have an extensive discussion of possession and devilry. It contains a really fascinating fairy tale from the South American Warra tribe, which is called the Spear Legs. And in that, two brothers go into the forest, so into an isolated nature environment, and they hear a huge party happening. One brother goes, this is dodgy, I don't want to go there. The other one goes, no, they're having a great time, we need to join in. So they go. The enthusiastic, I think, is the older brother, starts drinking and eating and having a great time. The younger brother is cautious about all of this. The next day after the party, the older brother starts manifesting symptoms of possession. And one of the symptoms I particularly love, he's behaving in bad ways. He burns his own legs off because he can't feel that the fire is burning him. And the reason the fire is burning him is because he threw way too much wood on it. And von Franz points out that in a non-industrial culture, putting too much wood on the fire is considered a reckless level of non-conformist behavior, because wood is a precious resource. And having just come from a camping trip, I can confirm wood is a precious resource at night when it's cold. So I love that bit. Okay, so in chapter 6, it compares the story of the spear legs with a Chinese story from the other side of the world, the Horse Mountain Ghost, and another South American one, the Rolling Skull. All these fairy tales from around the world carry a similar warning about evil creatures and the dangers they pose to people. In all of them, there's an element of aloneness. In the Chinese one, a girl decided to stay home because she didn't want to go to a drinking party, which you'd think would be a very praiseworthy response. But no, in this one, because she stayed alone without her tribe around her, she became open to an evil ghost. In the other two, you've got someone's going into the forest, which is nature. So again, they're alone and separated from their tribe, and bad things happen. And that aloneness von Franz talks about is a very human, pervasive feature. Fairy tales all around the world warn, I suppose, about the dangers of becoming isolated, whether you think about it as a psychic isolation or physical isolation. The one thing von Franz says is ubiquitous in fairy tales all the way around the world is the helper animals. There's always helper animals, whether they're foxes in Japanese mythology, or they're ravens in European mythology, or they're wolves. There's always helper animals, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes up to 8 in one story. The hero never ignores the helper animals, and anyone who treats the helper animals badly is automatically no longer the hero, and probably bad things are going to happen to them. In chapter 7, she draws attention to the emotional loading that modern stories put on the characters and how those are absent in fairy tales. So a fairy tale may say he felt dreadful, but he still went down the stairs. In a modern fairy story, or in a myth, they'd be talking a lot about the actual emotional loading and the personal experience, but in a fairy tale you get an almost detached, almost emotionless narration of it. In chapter 8, she talks about the ability to keep your temper, not get angry, and not be sucked into negativity, which is a frequent commonality in many of the tales where the hero is trying to overcome someone else. It's always about the hero remaining calm and collected and not giving into the anger, because once they give into the anger, then they lose. Page 206 mentions a rule of wisdom in fairy tales where everything of evil tends to produce a chain reaction. And then a bit further on, she stresses that the rise of Christianity has added a kind of spurt of evil to the principle of evil, which she feels did not really exist in mythology before that. So, chapter 10, Cold Evil. We start by looking at an absolutely great Norwegian fairy tale, The Giant Who Didn't Have His Heart With Him. It's an excellent, and I think it's a pretty well-known fairy tale overall among people who like fairy tales anyway. Von Franz assumes that this fairy tale is not older than Christianization of Norway, which still makes it pretty old. I think that's mid-1200s. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. That assumption is due to the presence of the church at the end of the story, and I feel that the entire story, including the duck egg holding the heart of the giant, which I'm sure everyone's heard of that, in a meme at least, I feel that the whole story could exist without the church, and the church might just have been added on later to make it more acceptable to the milieu. And there's a couple of other fairy tales where, to me, also it just feels like the church was tacked on. Von Franz suggests that while Norse mythology tended toward the masculine anyway, with the advent of Christianity, the patriarchy became more extreme and the feminine element retreated further into a primitive, almost vestigial element. And in this story, in terms of the psychology of the story, there is a court entirely lacking in feminine presence, and the sons go forth to bring that presence back to court. In order to do that, they have to overcome the emotional rigidity that the giant inflicts on the first sons, and the giant himself as a manifestation of darkness, subconscious, rigid mentality. I'm not sure. Great story. A bit later we get onto the Rose Red and Snow White, which I mentioned before. Von Franz says she doesn't care for this particular tale much. She describes them as portraying an infantile kindergarten attitude, and she suggests that with Christianity, the notion of becoming as a little child, which is central to Christianity, has often been incorrectly interpreted as behaving like a child, which is infantilizing the person. And being childish and disingenuously naive is apparently been an ongoing issue for many people that she's treated in sessions over the years, and she doesn't have much patience for it. I also never much liked Rose Red and Snow White. It didn't make a lot of sense. The children are too saccharine to be relatable. The mother is too absent to really understand why she's there at all. It has some interesting concepts, but the bear is an interesting concept. The two rose bushes are interesting concepts. But as a small child, I could never understand why the two girls kept on helping this dwarf that kept abusing them for helping you. Once, maybe, but the second time you'd at least give it two thoughts. No, they just keep on helping this person who abuses them. It's a very unsettling and unsatisfying fairy tale, in my opinion. And I guess I'm not alone with that, because, like I said, it has fallen out of favour a fair bit. So among the fairy tales of the European Christian milieu, they all seem to emphasize the anima feminine directing the action along with the animals. And Von Franz attributes that to the compensation for the too active masculinity that comes with the culture. But she also makes the point that that is a European Christian type thing. You don't see it as much in other cultures, especially not in Eastern cultures, and they may still be Christian, but their social motif is less, perhaps, masculinized. I'm not sure. Definitely, it's not like Asian societies have any lack of patriarchal, but apparently they have the feminine more actively integrated into their consciousness and don't need it to be the absent part of their fairy tale. In the Isis Egyptian fairy tales, for example, Isis is not the good helping figure that they so often are in European myths, but rather the dark witch-like figure. Okay, the final chapter of this book, which I've only just completed, is the Nucleuses of the Psyche. And I would say that this is Von Franz summing up a lecture series for people who are into Jungian psychology, maybe into analysis. It is not over-explaining anything, though really it's talking generically, and while it's a deeply satisfying chapter, it's hard to summarize it. It talks about a final fairy tale where the devil's daughter helps the hero defeat the devil and then escapes with him to the upper world. But I'd like to read a bit about it. In this fairy tale, the devil sets this... This fairy tale to me is a little bit different from many of the other ones, in that the son didn't actively go through hubris seeking out the devil and his daughter. He was forced to do that. The devil sets him 3 tasks. One of them is to plant a whole field of hay in an overgrown area and then harvest the hay. Then take rocky ground, plant a vineyard and harvest the grapes ready for threshing. And Marie Louise Von Franz describes these tasks in a way that really appeals to me. The first and second tasks are what one could call the civilization of nature, turning a lake into a meadow and cutting the hay, then turning the wood into a vineyard and gathering the grapes of the wine. This is a deep and amazing picture. For in more primitive societies, it is the hero who performs such civilizing tasks. Here, however, this activity has become evil, for the devil suggests it, and wants it done. In light of this story, one can't help questioning our technological exploitation of nature and reflecting on who is inspiring this kind of activity. It was once a civilizing task, but now overdone, much like the guy whippersnipping outside my window right now. Now overdone, it is falling into the autonomous hands of a devilish, destructive, unconscious activity, an extroverted restlessness which goes on and on beyond natural measure. So, yes, wonderful book. The final paragraph is, it is a very profound, mystical solution offered by fairy tale, but fairy tales only seem to be innocent stories. They are so profound that one cannot explain them superficially. They require that one dive into deep waters. A thing that I have always felt about fairy tales, and why I've been reading them my whole life and never planned to stop. Thank you for listening to this really, really long review, if you've made it this far. Tell me your favourite fairy tale. I'd be interested.